Okay, so we are live. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us. Sorry that it took a little bit of time to get connected today. We were just getting, as I said, getting the gremlins out of the system here. Thanks for joining us at Ghoul's Guide to Gothic Games. So this is coming to you as part of the Halloween season at the National Videogame Museum. We've been spending this Halloween looking at a couple of things. We've been celebrating Luigi's Mansion's anniversary with a Luigi bundle, which was really fun and really great to see on the museum floor. And we've also been looking into the genre of haunted houses by showcasing a series of games from the 1980s and onwards that basically looked at this Gothic genre that we love so much. So today we are going to be looking at the Gothic and video games. And I couldn't think of anyone better to talk to about this topic than Dr. Lauren Nixon, who is a wonderful researcher that I'm really lucky to have in my life. We've worked together previously on projects such as Gaming the Gothic, which did kind of what we're going to be doing today, which is looking at how the Gothic tradition and video games interact. So I'm going to give an introduction, which is definitely not going to feel weird, seeing as though I've known this person for nearly like a decade. So Dr. Lauren Nixon, who is here from Nottingham Trent University, is one half of the Ghoul Guides, which is a digital project devoted to all things Gothic. She is also co-founder of the Reimagining the Gothic project, which includes Gaming the Gothic, and is a co-host for the Rosenbach Museum's Sundays with series. You can check out the Ghoul Guides on their website, which is the Ghoul Guides, all one word, wordpress.com, or you can look at them via their Twitter, which is the Ghoul Guides again. So basically, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nixon, and she's basically going to give a talk for roughly around 40 minutes, and then we're going to go for a Q&A, which should be around 10 or 15 minutes. Basically, whether we have a lot of questions or we don't have a lot of questions, we'll see how long we go for. So I'll hand over to you now. Cheers.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, so Connor is very kindly sharing my slides for me today because for some reason my shared screen just didn't want to work. So we are going to do that very professional next slide, please thing. So I'm not arrogant. This is just tech happening as it does. So thank you, everybody. As Emily said, I am Dr. Lauren Nixon, and I am one half of the Ghoul Guides, a digital multimedia project that is devoted to taking the Gothic outside of the ivory tower and thinking about how we as a global society engage with this genre or mode that really has been around for the best part of about 2,000 years, depending on how we look at it. As long as there's been, human culture, there's been Gothic. But today I'm going to specifically talk to you about the Gothic in games. But first of all, we have to ask one very important question, and that is, what actually is the Gothic? So next slide, please, Connor. So what is the Gothic? It is a many-headed monster. It is literature, art, architecture, fashion, and subculture. When you think of the Gothic, you might think of Bauhaus or The Cure. You might think of a particular type of fashion. You might think of goth festivals in Whitby or a particular type of dress. You might think of eco-Gothic. You might think of instead vaulted arches and gargoyles and grotesques. Or you may think of Gothic literature, and you may think of Gothic art. And the reason that the Gothic spans all of these things is because it is, as I say, a many-headed monster. Because of the way that the Gothic has developed over the centuries, it finds itself in every part of human culture and society. And the Gothic is something that we use again and again and again. It respects and revolves around every different nation, every different society, every different person's anxieties. So where does the Gothic begin? Next slide, please. Yes, this is a recess joke. I am a millennial, so instead of, ooh, scandalous, ooh, barbarous. So I'm taking you right back to 410 AD, and you might be thinking, what the heck does 410 AD have to do with video games? And I promise that this is relevant. So what I want to take you back to is a particular Germanic tribespeople who lived on the borders of the Roman Empire in the early 300s, 400s. Originally, they were split into separate tribes, most famously the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. But in the early 5th century, they were united under a single king, Alaric. And they were not particularly pleased with Rome. By this point, the Roman Empire had spread. It was huge. It spread across parts of Europe and Africa, and it had become rather large and unwieldy. It was actually quite difficult for them to manage such a large empire centrally. And the Goths kind of, looked at the lay of the land and said, why? Well, basically, why? Why does Rome get to have all of this resource, all of this land, all of this money? And they decided that we're going to take this into our own hands. There were 3 separate campaigns, but the third of which is the most significant, and that's the one that happens in 410 AD, when Alaric leads the Goths on a sack of Rome and essentially completely decimates the city over the course of 3 days. Now, this has been popularly imagined in art and culture for hundreds of years. And the reason that this is so significant is because in the West, we consider ancient Rome to be really the be-all and end-all when it comes to classic culture and civilization. Europe has long imagined Rome to be the best, the brightest that humankind has ever had to offer. Rome is all things civilized, it's democratic, it's art and culture. So the Goths sacking Rome led the word Goth and the idea of Gothic to become something that was an antithesis. So Goth in these early centuries becomes a term that means barbaric, barbarous, violent. And Gothic is uncivilized, undemocratic, the antithesis of everything that was ancient Rome. So our first meaning of the word Gothic is barbarous and barbaric. And this is important because it comes to define what we think of as being Gothic. And perhaps you're already thinking that you can see how this might come into play in video games, considering that violence is a part of a lot of the games that we play. I don't want to simplify that too much. We're going to talk about it later, but I'm just kind of hoping that you're staying with me and you're not thinking, why is this woman talking about ancient Rome in a talk about video games? I promise this is relevant. Next slide, please. So, the word Gothic, probably also think of it meaning death, the supernatural, the macabre, the morbid. And that very much comes from the Middle Ages. So we're talking sort of 500 to 1500. This is a very long period. And I'm not going to get into the nuances of how we refer to the Middle Ages and the medieval, because that's not important right now. But this is where the Gothic begins to take on many of the elements that you might recognise. This is where superstition, mysticism, memento mori, architecture all start to become important. Now, superstition is important because during this period of time, we have a Catholic Church that is particularly involved and interested in maintaining centralised power. Bibles were written in Latin, priests were responsible for giving sermons. Most of the general populace could not read the Bible for themselves and therefore were reliant on an educated lord or a priest to read it for them. And again, this is a massive overgeneralization, but just to give you an idea of why this is important, why these religious aspects are important. So we get superstition and mysticism. So this is where things like folklore and folktale come into it. Things like changeling children and will-o'-wisps. The idea that there is something that exists on the outskirts of our Christian society that might tempt us or harm us or lead us astray. So the supernatural. We also have in this period of time something called the chivalric romance, which if any of you recently saw The Green Knight, the David Lowery film, that is very much I mean, in the beginning of the film it says this is a chivalric romance. These were tales of knights and dragons and damsels in distress, the kind of Arthurian literature that you might be familiar with. Often tales of a lone soldier, a lone knight touring the country and rescuing townspeople or villagers from an ogre or a giant or some kind of supernatural terror and threat that came upon them. This was also a period of death. This is a period of the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, of unknown illnesses that ripped through towns and cities and countries quicker than anybody could do anything about them. And there was a tradition at this time called memento mori, literally translating to remember that you will die. Life in the Middle Ages was incredibly short and incredibly precious. And we get this fantastic movement in art, and that's what we've got on the screen here. This is an example of a movement called Danse Macabre. And Danse Macabre came out of Germany, as so much of the Gothic does, and it very much became popular around the times of the Great Plagues. And these great, huge, they were often long tapestries or long mosaic reliefs. This one is the Tallinn Danse Macabre. Not much of it survives. It's this fantastic church painting that goes all around the side of the church, and it shows skeletons and corpses dancing into the town like they are, the Pied Piper, like a festival, and taking everybody away with them, regardless of whether or not they are noble or peasant. They dance into town, they play their music, and they carry everybody off to death with them. And this is because this is a period in time where, as I just said, death is very present. And this idea of memento mori, remember that you will die, was very important because one needed to be reminded that death was the ultimate leveler, that all would die and life was precious, and particularly life under God's view. And this is also reflected in architecture. If you have been to places such as Barcelona Cathedral or Winchester Cathedral, you may have seen, or York Minster is also a fantastic example if you're up in the north like us, these fantastic vaulted ceilings and reliefs. You will often see images like tombs in which on the top of the tomb you have the sculpture of the person who is buried there as they looked in life. And then beneath them, you have this skeletal, decaying sculpture to remind you, as the viewer, what happens when we die. And these were often built during one's life. You would commission them during your life for the period when you died. So this is a very Gothic period. But the reason that we think of it as being Gothic is actually because of the Renaissance. And you might be familiar with the Renaissance as being a period of reclamation. The Renaissance was supposed to be the revival of art and culture lost after the fall of Rome and into the Dark Ages, so to speak. So in the Renaissance, there was a reclamation of the classic. So Greek and Roman architecture and art in particular, which is very funny because actually we know now that Greek and Roman statues were very brightly painted. But in the Renaissance, we found, all of these artifacts of these beautiful marble statues, and we assumed that they had always been that beautiful white marble. So this classic neoclassicism, as it comes to be called, image becomes incredibly popular. And everything that was popular in the medieval or the Middle Ages becomes bad. This is the beginning of what we call the Age of Enlightenment, the beginning of science and ration and learning. And the Renaissance kind of looked back at the Middle Ages and went, ugh, ew, there's a lot of death in this. It's very supernatural. It's not very sensible. It's very dark. It's very morbid. It's bad. It's bad art. And the Gothic then became a word to mean bad art because Gothic meant barbaric. And if Gothic was barbaric and barbarous and uncivilized, that meant it was bad. And if the Renaissance was trying to reclaim the glory of ancient Rome and define itself as a European inheritor to ancient Rome, then it needed something to define itself against this bad art of the Middle Ages. So all of this, the superstition, the supernatural, the mysticism, Catholicism, chivalric romances, the idea of memento mori, architecture, everything that defines what we think of as that period became Gothic. But not because it was good, because they thought it was really, really bad. So it kind of becomes a sneer. Oh, that's Gothic. You know, it's antiquated, it's old, disgusting, it's bad art. So Gothic becomes barbarous, bad, uncivilized, other, the antithesis of civilization. Next slide, please. And this is where we get the Gothic as we know it today. The Gothic doesn't really become a defined genre until 1764, when an MP called Horace Walpole, who was actually the son of the first Prime Minister, publishes a text called The Castle of Otranto. And in the first edition of this novel, he said, this is not actually a novel. This was found in the attic of an ancient Scottish family. And it's translated from an Italian text that was written by a monk who was told this tale. Those of you who have played anything that involves, found manuscripts or found footage or are familiar with that horror trope, this might be starting to sound familiar. He presents this text not as a novel, not as a fabrication, but as something that was real, a found piece of evidence of this supernatural going on. It is the most ridiculous novel that you may perhaps ever read. It begins with a giant helmet crushing the Prince of Otranto's sickly son to death on the day of his marriage. And the Prince of Otranto then decides, because of an ancient curse, that he will marry his son's bride, and then he begins to chase her around the castle. There's all sorts of supernatural goings on. A peasant appears who turns out to be the actual heir to Otranto. And it's not a particularly long book. It's only about this big, but it is camp, it is expressive, it is supernatural, and it is everything that neoclassicism is not. So this idea of Gothic literature becomes a thing, and this new literary mode is born. So in the late 18th century, Gothic becomes still barbaric and supernatural and interested in the macabre and the morose, but it also becomes play, it becomes camp, it becomes this kind of terror and exhilaration for the reader. It becomes a mode that is interested in playing with your ideas and your expectations of what is going to happen. And from this novel, we get a whole host of other texts. Over 150 years, really, of Gothic literature. And I'm going to kind of leave the history lesson there because that's what you all really need to know to kind of move on to this next bit. But this is the foundation that Gothic games are working on. So where does the Gothic come into video games? Next slide, please. Evolutions and mutations. Now, I often refer to the Gothic as a mutant snowball because, or since this, oh my God, I can actually use the Katamari reference with an audience that's probably going to get it. It's the best day ever. The Gothic is basically a Katamari. It rolls through the centuries, through the decades, through the nations, and it picks things up as it goes along. And everywhere it rolls through, it becomes something else, but it still maintains its original meaning. So it's not that it transforms into something completely new. It's more like it digivolves. It becomes the same thing it already was and something additional. Hence, Mutant Snowball, or for this audience, finally, a Katamari. And this is where the Gothic and games become very interestingly intertwined, because gaming and video gaming in particular gives the Gothic this whole new platform, and it uses it very, very well. Gaming is interactive, either on a single player or a multiplayer level. Games are designed to be replayed. Games can change when they are replayed. We can add DLC, we can add sequels. And yes, there have always been errata to novels and sequels and prequels, but the very format of video gaming gives the Gothic something new to latch onto. And it very much mutates in this fascinating way that in the last 30 or 40 years has really changed the face of what we think of as being Gothic. Next slide, please. But is it Gothic? Now, this was our catchphrase at Sheffield Gothic, and it's a bit of a joke. We always say, but is it Gothic? And that's because the Gothic in contemporary media kind of seems a little bit like you could call anything Gothic. And well, what meaning, if we can call anything Gothic, what meaning does it have? If something is applicable to everything, does it lose its meaning? No, is the answer to that question. Gothic aesthetics, Gothic narratives, and Gothic play are all really important here. And what I really want to kind of point out at this point of this talk is that everything being Gothic means that everything has meaning. It doesn't devalue it. But actually, by thinking about different elements of gaming and different elements of video games as text, not just as something that we consume, allows us to come up with some very interesting readings. And what I'm going to do essentially is kind of split into three trains of thought here: Gothic aesthetic, Gothic narrative, and Gothic play. Because a game can be overtly aesthetically Gothic, but not necessarily narratively Gothic or Gothic in a play experience. Similarly, a game that does not look Gothic at all can be very heavily Gothic in its narrative. And I will give some examples in a moment. But one of the best ones that I can think of off the top of my head is Kingdom Hearts. Kingdom Hearts is a game that uses Disney characters. Ostensibly, on the surface, it looks to be the furthest thing that you could get from Gothic, apart from the bit where you get to go to the Nightmare Before Christmas realm. However, the actual play experience and narrative structure of Kingdom Hearts, particularly the multifaceted game aspect, is inherently Gothic. And by using Gothic theory, we can interpret some very interesting things about that game and what that game says about us as a society. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. Next slide, please. Okay, so the video game as a Gothic novel. The video game has allowed the Gothic novel to take on new life. And what I mean here is that not necessarily just games that are visual novels, but games that take the core elements of a Gothic novel and make them playable. One of the best examples that I can think of is indeed 2017's Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods takes multiple elements, multiple tropes of the Gothic novel and lays them into a game format. The game also has multiple options, multiple endings, multiple routes that you can take, and locks you out of taking certain ones so that you must play the game again and again. And depending on how you choose to play the game depends on what happens. Now, this might seem like something that a Gothic novel inherently cannot do, but that's only because of the way that it's restricted by its format. Video games have given the Gothic novel a new scope, essentially. And what's really fascinating and really interesting is that this platform, this digital element, essentially works like a novel. The Gothic novel is not one singular thing, and it would be difficult for me to say every Gothic novel must have these elements. You know, it must have a castle, it must have a heroine, it must have a dark villain and a secret. But there are identifiable tropes. And there are multiple identifiable things. And the Gothic novel is something that is reborn every 10 to 20 years, shall we say. The Gothic novel responds directly to the anxieties of its society. And it's often used as a communication device between two connected groups. For example, in the late 1700s, when the Napoleonic Wars were raging, Gothic writers, particularly women writers, used Gothic novels and setting them in Italy in the 15th century to represent the very real threats of living in Britain during a period of war in 1784. And they used the novel to communicate with other young women who they wouldn't otherwise be able to connect with. Games like In the Woods do this on a very, very similar level. They are essentially transforming, evolving, upgrading the way that the Gothic novel works. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but you've also put Luigi's Mansion on this slide, Lauren, and how does Luigi's Mansion do the same thing? But what I want you to think about is, why do we read Gothic novels? One of the reasons that we read Gothic novels is because we want to be scared, we want to do something a bit different, or we want to have that kind of thrill experience. And that is sometimes also camp. Luigi's Mansion is a fantastic example of the camp Gothic. It's not that different from the Castle of Otranto. The Castle of Otranto features the protagonists running around a decaying castle from a madman as a giant helmet crushes someone to death, or a huge suit of armor appears over the castle and booms a prophecy and then the whole castle falls down. It's not that different from the kind of things that happen in Luigi's Mansion. It's that same campness. And just because it's camp and bright doesn't mean it doesn't have that Gothic undertone of, there's something a bit weird here. There's something a bit unsettling here. And that's why Man from Medan is also on here. That is ostensibly a horror game experience that forces you to walk through a classic Gothic novel narrative as a player. So really, one of the things that Gothic games are able to do is give the Gothic novel a new manifestation, a new ability. It powers it up. And yes, they are not books that you read and turn pages, but they very, very much work in the same way as the Gothic novel. And really, this is something that we haven't yet as scholars been able to dig into. But the next time you play, particularly something like Life is Strange or Night in the Woods, think about how it works as a text and a story, how it kind of feels like you're playing through a novel. And what does that do? What does that mean for you as a player? And I will talk about that in a moment. But first, let's talk about reimagining Gothic. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the other things that really is inescapable when it comes to Gothic gaming is reanimations, literally. Now, in some cases, this is games like Medieval, which was already reanimating a Gothic trope in the 90s, and then was remade, so literally was reanimating a reanimation of a reanimation, which when you think about the fact that the main character is undead, it gets even more meta, which in of itself is incredibly Gothic. But video games enable reworkings of traditional Gothic conventions and aesthetics. Some of the classic examples include Castlevania, which draws not so much on Dracula as a text as it does Dracula as a corpus of work. It uses the Hammer horror films, it uses Nosferatu, it uses Dracula reimaginings. And Castlevania as a game series that has in itself sparked animations, demonstrates the way in which the Gothic can be used to continue and enable when games are involved. Castlevania gives the Gothic something that a film, a stage play, or an anime, or a novel can't really. And this is also reflected in things like Medieval, but also in games like Child of Light and Hollow Knight. Now, Child of Light and Hollow Knight probably in some ways its play experience couldn't be different. But what both games do is they use identifiable traditional Gothic aesthetics. And to an extent, particularly with something like Child of Light, you could say this makes it predictable. Because it's engaging with these classic things, we know what's going to happen. But that is not entirely true because we are a new audience and we are a new generation. And Child of Light in particular uses the classic folklore style chivalric romance Gothic tale to tell a story with a protagonist that is familiar but new. And this is drawing on the Gothic tradition of the uncanny or unheimlich. And this is a Freudian idea, but Freud is super problematic, so we try to move away from him as much as possible. But the uncanny is this idea of something being same but different. Something that you know, something that is familiar but feels off. And Child of Light and Hollow Knight both do this very, very well. They use these elements, these aesthetics, these tropes that we all know, but they do something slightly different with them. And that, for us as a player, can have a multitude of effects. Now, of course, this is possible in other visual medias. It's possible in animation, it's possible in television, it's possible in film. But games allow you to do this slightly differently because you have a certain amount of control over what the character or the avatar or the world looks like. You are able to equip certain weapons. You are able to choose which companions you take along. You're able to choose, to a certain extent, how you play the game. And Gothic games take that into account. Castlevania does this frequently and particularly plays with ideas of time and linear narratives. Let's just leave it there. And the audience's expectation of a Dracula text. So reanimations are something really that are unique to games, and only games are able to really provide this level of Gothic play and interplay. And I just think that's really cool. Let's think about play experience, because I've been touching on this, and really this is probably one of the biggest things. So next slide, please. Okay. Play experience. This is something that only games are able to give. And so many games have done this incredibly well. And I've kind of summed it up here on the slide as look Gothic, play Gothic, feel Gothic. These are games that are aesthetically Gothic, narratively Gothic, and play Gothic. And this is something that is really interesting because, for example, the Souls games and Bloodborne do something that some gamers don't like. They make it incredibly difficult. I am very, very bad at these games. I have to watch Let's Plays because I'm just terrible at them. I'm not good at them. But there's a reason that these games are so difficult. And it's not just because, oh yeah, the harder the game, the better the gamer. It's because the experience of play forces you to have a Gothic experience. And this is something that novels and stage plays and films can only just touch upon. The Gothic novel is designed to make you, the reader, feel empathy with the character. And this is where terror comes into it. Terror has been imagined as something that expands your mind. The experience of terror and going through terror essentially takes you to another plane of existence. It's this kind of exhilarating rebirth effect. And it's something that is used in Gothic novels often as a sort of, trial or passage, a homecoming, or a kind of proving your worth. Often these stories are Bildungsroman. The protagonist faces the terrifying thing, comes through it, and is then heroic. Gothic games force you to have that experience. You are no longer reader or viewer. You are the active participant. And games like Until Dawn make this explicit. In Until Dawn, you are forced to become the play, essentially. Not only are you not just one character, you are multiple characters. You're forced to make decisions quickly. You are forced to, press buttons in a certain context that you don't necessarily get to redo. You know the whole way through the game that something is going to happen because you are familiar with those tropes. Now, Until Dawn is particularly clever because it uses multiple Gothic tropes. Playing Until Dawn as a Gothic scholar is one of the worst experiences of my entire life because every single thing I see on that game, I'm like, oh, well, that could happen, and that could happen, and that could happen. And the game plays on that. It forces you to be kind of on your guard at all times. So you, the player, are forced into the Gothic experience. You must go through the trial of terror if you want to succeed at the game. A novel cannot quite do that. And this is not to say that novels aren't as good as games or there's no merit there. What I want to really highlight is that this is something fantastic. this is something beautiful, that video games enable this continuation. And I'll talk a bit about why that's important, because, you know, all of these things have meaning. But this is it's just something that everything, you know, it's just something special. It's something that you cannot fully embody in a different type of medium. Next slide, please. And this is where one of the Gothic, and particularly contemporary Gothic's, kind of key elements comes into play: self-identification with the other. Now, the other is defined in a multiple different ways by different theorists, but to put it simply, it is literally that which is not ourselves. It is that which is different. It is that which exists on the outside or on the peripheries of society, or that which challenges the status quo. Now, the Gothic can either be revolutionary or it can be conventional. Some Gothic presents the other as monstrous, terrifying. The other must be defeated. It must be put down. It must not be allowed to challenge the status quo. But the other can also be a positive celebration of otherness, a self-identification that allows individuals to explore non-traditional identities. And this is something that has been very popular in the Gothic since its inception, but particularly since the 1980s. And this is where Goth subculture comes into it. Goth as a subculture is a self-identification with otherness in a way that is positive. It's an embracing of one's individuality and embracing of one's difference. And video games do something very interesting here because of that experience that I just talked about. Video games permit a more in-depth connection between player and character. And this can either demonstrate to an individual who does not connect with otherness how it feels to be other. Games like Detroit Being Human do this. Games like a lot of the dating sims, visual novels do this really, really well. We've seen a lot of fantastic games in more recent years that do this. But Detroit Becoming Human is a really good example because of the way that plays with the idea of humanity. It forces you as the player to go through the experience of otherness. And one of the examples I want to bring to your attention to is a beautiful game from 2019 by a French studio called Label Games, called The Wanderer, or Frankenstein's Creature. And in this game, you play as Frankenstein's creature. You begin by waking up in the lab. You have no idea what you are, who you are, or where you are. You have been abandoned by your creator, and you know nothing of the world. And you move your way through this beautiful kind of watercolor scenery, trying to learn more. And the mechanics of the game allow you to experience the creature's struggle on a level that is difficult to force a reader or a viewer into. There's a really fantastic moving scene about a quarter of the way into the game where the creature goes for the first time into a village, and he just wants to talk to the children, wants to play a game. He's a very childlike, new being. And it's the first time that he realizes that he is monstrous and he is horrifying. And you as the player must try and escape the village. And the game makes this very difficult. It is very difficult for you to actually control the creature and move him out of the village to safety. And the purpose of this is to kind of create a response and a reaction, to show the player what it must feel like to be the creature. And it allows this experimentation and exploration with otherness in a way that we've never really been able to see before, because you essentially embody. The connection between player and character, or player and avatar, goes deeper than a hack-slash situation. Not that hack-slash games don't do this as well, or do it in a very way, but this is a great example because this is a Gothic text that has been made into a video game, and perhaps not the video game that one expects. It's not a horror game, it's not a jump scare game. It is this very kind of beautifully rendered, slow-paced, confusing game, and it is very, very confusing to play. You as the player only have a certain amount of knowledge because the creature also only has a certain amount of knowledge, and it allows you to experience that in a way that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able. So video games permit this positive exploration of otherness, either because individuals can find characters who represent them, particularly in games like World of Warcraft or Dragon Age, that allow you to create your own avatar or create your own character so that you are able to play as you visualize yourself or play as you imagine yourself or would wish yourself to be. But as well, it enables you to be able to play something that you would not otherwise be able to experience. And this is something that we're increasingly, I think over the next couple of years, we'll start to see more so. Which leads me to my next slide, please. Oh, I think I just got booted out slightly there. Okay, I'm back. There we go. Tech problems can't get the best of me. Okay, so a new dawn. This is what I'm kind of calling this. And this is probably my most nebulous slide because it's hard to really characterize this in a single slide. But the experimentation that we have seen in the last 10 to 15 years when it comes to video games and the Gothic is unparalleled. Metatextuality and multiplicity has always been a really important part of Gothic storytelling. As I mentioned earlier on in the talk, things like the Castle of Otranto were presented as a found manuscript, translated by somebody. And the Gothic is often played with the idea of being pieced together or discovered or written in the back of a Bible or onto another text. And we've always had this idea of multiple narratives or multiple endings or missing parts of a story. Even Dracula is written as letters and diary entries. It's very carefully dated. But then it leads us to think, well, what happens on the in-between? How reliable are narrators? Who is telling us this story? And video games have done this in a way that is really exciting. One of the examples that I've listed here is the Final Fantasy series as Fabula Nova Crystallis series. And this includes the Final Fantasy 13 games, so Final Fantasy 13, 13-2, and Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy Type 0 and Agito, which were combined into a single game and re-released on PlayStation 4, and Final Fantasy 15. And there's also been elements of Final Fantasy 14 that have kind of come into this. But because that is an MMO, I'm kind of leaving it out of the discussion just because it's still ongoing. And that's a different type of scholarship. But what these games do is they play with the idea that Final Fantasy is a recognized series. We all know that Final Fantasy always has crystals, it always has chocobos, there's always a Cid, there's always a Biggs and Wedge, there's summons, there's a white mage, there's a black mage. It has these elements that all gamers who have interacted with the series at any point over its, multiple decade history are familiar with. And the Fabula Nova Crystallis series essentially sought to not challenge it or rewrite it. It's not a reboot, but it's what can we do differently and how do these games interconnect if we acknowledge them as interconnection? And originally, Final Fantasy 15 was imagined as 13-2. So we know for a fact that the Lightning games and the Noctis series were supposed to interlink in some way. But what's fascinating about these games is the way in which they subvert the usual narrative process. Particularly Type 0. Type 0 is a game that is specifically designed to be replayed. And you can only see certain elements of the game on the second time you play it. And the second time you play it, you do not start at the beginning. And this is something that we've started to see more since in other games, but Type 0 does it as an actual narrative plot point. In Type 0, when you finish the game, there are, to begin with, two possible endings. neither of which are particularly the good ending. One of which forces you to go into an endless cycle of combat, and the other of which I won't spoil, but is not the most satisfying for the gamer. However, you are then encouraged to begin the game again, but you begin the game at the level that you finished the game. So you begin the game at level 50 or 60, and this is a game that has tightly controlled the narrative all the way through. It's done in days, which means you only have a certain amount of time. Those days are up to you. You could play one day for hours and hours and hours and hours, but every time you go back to the central location, the next day starts. When you restart the game, you realize that there are things that didn't happen the first time. And as the story that you were expecting to be the same story begins to play out, you begin to realize that there are additional elements, new things that you didn't anticipate or see the first time. It is a game that is specifically designed to be played more times. And this is not to piss the gamer off or to make the gamer angry. It's not to, this isn't necessarily, they don't make any profit from forcing you to play it multiple times. It's an experimentation with how we take on narrative. And this is what then happens with Final Fantasy 15 and most interestingly, the Final Fantasy 7 remake. And I won't say too much about the remake because only part 1 is out and we are not 100% sure. And everything I say about it at this point is basically just conspiracy theory, which is not really something I should be doing as an academic. But what we can kind of see in terms of the direction that 7 is going so far, in terms of, so there's this addition of this narrative aspect called characters that seem to appear when the story attempts to divert from the original game. And we see a very similar thing happen in Final Fantasy 15. We have this play with time, with narrative structure, with repetition, and the idea that something can happen again and again and again. And at what point are we, the player, playing the story? So this series does something that has been hinted at, has been grasped at by the Gothic for centuries. But finally, in video gaming and the platform of video gaming and the actual mechanics, what we're seeing is actual mechanics of video games being used to shape narrative. So we're having that physical metatextual elements. And we also see this in games like Kingdom Hearts, where the player has played each game, but the characters don't necessarily know what happened in previous games. So, for example, in Chain of Memories, which is the kind of interim game between the first and the second Kingdom Hearts, the characters lose their memory. When we begin Kingdom Hearts 2, Sora, Donald, and Goofy, the 3 main characters, don't know what happened in that game, but the player does, unless the player did not have that platform. So it also takes into account that not all the games were released on the same platform, which means not all players will be privy to all the knowledge. And rather than this blocking players from the full game experience, the game takes it into the game experience, that both character and player has missing knowledge. And what does that mean for the experience? And what does that do to the game? And I also want to touch on games like the Dragon Age series and the Witcher series, which use noticeable kind of classic Gothic tropes in a way that is very familiar, but do something very interesting. And Dragon Age in particular does this. Dragon Age as a series is aware of the fact that the player may have played all 3 games, and therefore the events in the 3rd game are dictated by the choices that the player made in the first and second games, and the player is unable to predict how this will happen. And even though the narrative does have a structure, certain things will happen, you, the player, are forced to deal with the consequences of your actions. And this is something that games like Fable have also done, and The Witcher does this very, very well because there are multiple endings and it's difficult to know which ending you're going to get. But I point specifically to Dragon Age because Dragon Age also employs Gothic storytelling. In Dragon Age 2, for example, we discover towards the beginning of the game that we are actually playing Varric's version of events. And the game purposefully leaves enough time between these scenes in which Varric is telling the story to Cassandra for the player to forget that this is happening. It then throws everything into question. And we then are reminded that at the end of the first game, the game tells us that certain things happened, depending on what choices you make with Cullen, for example, and Liliana. the end of the first game tells you that certain things happen to them. However, these characters appear in both the second and third games, regardless of what you chose for them. And the game then forces you to realize that the information it gave you at the end of the first game is not necessarily true. And in fact, the narrative that you play in the second game may not necessarily be true, because there are points where you're forced to replay. For example, the scene in which Varric and his companions, Hawk, go into this haunted house, and we have this great classic haunted house narrative where the red lyrium is causing things to float around. It's like poltergeist. And we realize partway through the scene that this is actually Varric's creation. This isn't what happened. This isn't what they experienced. This is Varric, a storyteller, telling us what we expect from a haunted house story. And this then means that not only does the game's mechanics force the player to have that Gothic play experience I mentioned, it also uses the mechanics and the setup of the game to play with storytelling in of itself. It's also very Gothic to look at. The Temple of Sacred Ashes in particular in the third game, is a really haunting scene. That is a game that plays with all three elements. Gothic play, Gothic aesthetics, and Gothic narrative. But the way that it does it, and this is why I'm focusing on Dragon Age rather than The Witcher, because The Witcher does have that multiple ending. There are certain things that Dragon Age forces to be canon. And rather than that complicating the play experience and the way that the game plays out, it actually takes that on board. That forced canon plus the player interaction creates this strange multiplicity. So when they release things like comic books, the question is not, is this in canon or not in canon, but who's telling the story? How reliable is this narrator? Is this imagined within the universe or not? Who has power over this? And that is something that, only Gothic gaming can do. Having that multiplicity, having the ability to have animated films, a web series, a novel series, a comic book series, and games that all in some ways contradict each other, yet are all also canon. And the Gothic and the engagement with the Gothic is what permits that. So, where do we go from here? Next slide, please. As Dracula would say, my revenge. Of course, there's games being developed every minute of every day, and I'm sure in 3 weeks' time certain things I've said in this talk might become defunct because new things will have been released. And this is one of the wonderful things about working and talking about video games, is there's always things happening. But what I want to draw attention to before we finish is the possibilities for mobile gaming, improved interactivity, and VR. That Gothic experience that we talked about, we're already seeing that in VR gaming, in the zombie experiences, which are now in shopping centres across the country. You can go with your friends, have a 45-minute VR experience where you shoot zombies. And that is something that science fiction has been imagining for decades, but is now a reality. And as we move forwards, these games will become more narratively focused. They will not just be experiences. They are more likely to become drawn out narratives. And I'm really excited to see what that does in terms of the representations of our social anxieties. There's a reason that zombies are so popular, and it's not just because we can shoot them and not have too much conscience. Zombies are popular because zombies represent everything we as a society are afraid of. They are degenerate, they are infectious, they are multiple. Particularly in COVID times, zombies are something that represent our anxieties very clearly. And it's no wonder that games like Resident Evil are able to go on in multiple different formats, because they embrace all these different Gothic elements: vampires, zombies, magic, supernatural. And I suspect that we will see games like Resident Evil and games like Fallout and The Witcher, these games that very, very clearly use the supernatural, use science fiction, use fantasy to embody our own fears and our own anxieties as a society. I think we will see this happen in VR. And gaming is more accessible than it ever has been before. And mobile gaming is increasingly popular, and we are seeing games from companies like MiHoYo, who produce Genshin Impact and Honkai Impact, become extremely popular with gamers. And Honkai Impact in particular uses heavily Gothic tropes and themes, but even there, we see these connections between Honkai and Genshin Impact that are incredibly Gothic, and that is a story for another time. Because particularly Genshin, it does the same thing that Kingdom Hearts does. It's very cute, it's very colourful, and under the surface you have this very dark, very Gothic story that has implications both for the world within the game and for the player. These are games that are accessible on a mobile phone. And increasingly what we will see, and what we are seeing with visual novels, is that player interaction. Games like Mystic Messenger enabled the player to be telephoned. You know, depending on what happened and what route you chose, the characters in the game could phone you and you could have a conversation with them. And that's going to become more advanced and more nuanced as it goes along. And I suspect we'll see more games like one of the more recent GTA games did this, where you had an app on your phone and the game interacted with the app on your phone. It's drawing the player in on a level that we haven't yet seen before. And I suspect as time goes on, particularly in the next couple of years, the Gothic as a way to understand and interpret games is going to become even more important. And I'm going to leave it there because I could talk about this for much longer. I've just got one. My last slide is just a thank you slide. So I know that this is quite a lot of information, and you know, this is very much an overview of why the Gothic is so important in gaming and how the Gothic interacts with gaming, and really what it means. But I hope you all find it enjoyable, and thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to be clapping, clapping, just me clapping. Hi. Great. Thanks so much for that, Dr. Nixon, Dr. Lauren Nixon. Thank you very much. That was really great. Obviously, information that is really timely to be discussing right now. Just so everyone knows, apologies for any technical issues we've had during this talk. It's a little bit ramshackle, but we're going to keep soldiering on. So we're basically going to do a bit of a Q&A session. If anyone has any questions that you are desperate to know about, feel free to pop them in the chat to the side, or the side reversed. I'm going to start with one that is definitely off the top of my head and not one that we discussed earlier, which is basically, you've mentioned Castlevania. Now, I love that you mentioned Castlevania and that you mentioned Mystery House, probably because they were two games that we included in our Halloween offering at the NBM, so I'm a little bit partial towards both of them. I just wanted to ask you, like, why do you think it is that texts like Dracula are just so infinitely adaptable? Like, you talked about that there's so many different versions of this text. What is it about these stories that really keeps them being remade?
Well, part of it is kind of what I just mentioned in terms of the way that the Gothic reflects anxiety. Dracula will mean something different to every generation that reads it. You know, the original Dracula is a fin de siècle novel. It comes out at a period, you know, right at the end of the 19th century. People are very worried about a lot of things, particularly feminism and sexuality, and, you know, the possible invasion of otherness and anxieties about... I mean, white people are always anxious about people passing as white, but Dracula is a great example of that. You know, oh, he's not the right type of white because he's from like Eastern Europe and they're uncivilized. So there's always going to be something that you find in that novel that a society can kind of connect to, and that's the bit that they'll focus on. So to a certain extent, every generation is going to want a new adaptation of Dracula because it's going to mean something different to them. The other thing is that the Gothic leaves a lot of space in between. You know, I mentioned that Dracula is told through diary entries and letters and telegrams. There's a lot of space in between that, and there's a lot of possibility and potentiality. You know, we never fully find out in Dracula how Dracula becomes a vampire. That's a question that's left unanswered by the text, and that means that it's something we can pick up, and that's something that Castlevania does. You know, why is this person doing these things? Why is he the way that he is? Why is he obsessed with, you know, Mina and coming to London? And, you know, why? Like, where's the answer to this question? And I think that's part of it, that, you know, there's always something left unsaid. There's always something that's not quite there. And that's it captures people. It captures people's imaginations. And Castlevania does that so well. And then it takes Dracula and gives Dracula new lore. And then we see text inspired by, not by Dracula by Bram Stoker, but Dracula by Castlevania. And then, you know, it becomes this whole Katamari snowball of Gothicness.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's bang on it. I've just got a question. I've just seen a question in the chat saying, this is from Kirk. Do you have any thoughts on why so many high-profile Japanese games have Gothic themes, such as Castlevania and Dark Souls? And I think that's a very, like, I love that you've given 2 examples, because you could have really gone on for a while. There are so many examples of, I think, Japanese games that use Gothic themes. Oh, and have I lost Lauren?
I'm back.
Great. So,
okay.
Did you get the question?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so the question was,
it's very on theme. It's very Gothic, like, you know.
Yep. Meta. We're having loads of different, multiple layers of conversation are happening here. Yep. The question was from Kirk, and it says, do you have any thoughts on why so many high-profile Japanese games have Gothic themes? And I was saying that there's a long list that you could have of Japanese games that have Gothic themes.
Part of this is kind of relating to a theory that of an academic I know that hasn't been published yet, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But part of it is because the Gothic's always been really interested in Orientalism. And this is one of the kind of negative otherness representations that the Gothic has done over the years, presenting, you know, the Oriental as the other, and this very negative stereotype of Orientalism that, you know, the East, particularly China and Japan, are mystical and magical, and often, particularly in kind of late 19th century Gothic, that's a way to create a monster, because it's something that we don't understand, and it's something different, it's from another culture. And a lot of Asian Gothic flips that, and it uses very Western Gothic aesthetics and tropes to create this alternative otherness and push back against it. And sometimes, you know, this is just done aesthetically. You know, we have this in anime like Sailor Moon and Evangelion. It uses heavily Christian, particularly Catholic imagery and language, but it's not really about engaging with Christianity. It's just using an aesthetic. That's what the 19th century Gothic does to Asian culture. It kind of reduces it to this like, ooh, mystical. And so part of it is a pushback, and part of it is a reclamation, but part of it is also because, again, it is that otherness. You know, these Western Gothic styles are not, particularly in Japanese gaming, Japanese Gothic. Japanese Gothic is very, very intricate and in-depth. It's a culture that is, you know, has a long history of interest in the supernatural and tradition. And we do see games like Okami. We see games that use yokai. Final Fantasy in particular often will use like traditional folklore monsters and blend them with folklore from other countries. But I think in terms of why these Japanese games use Western Gothic, it's because it is other. It is uncanny and it is different. So it is, you know, a fascination with something that is excessive and decadent and, you know, dripping with this like disgusting luxury in a lot of cases. And it's old and it's kind of, you know, this fascination with something that is other and different. And I think Japanese games do this really, really well, because there's often in British Gothic, there's a temptation to move conventionally. And you see this in a lot of games that are interested in things like Knights Templar. They tend to tell conventional, traditional stories that don't really give as much as a culture. Whereas that outsider perspective, kind of looking in, you are able to actually tell a story and kind of do something. But essentially, it's kind of reverse Orientalism. That's what's happening. It's pushing back against this tradition of like, oh, you know, this is like a gilt Chinese box. You know, you get that so much in 19th century Gothic. There's literally a story where a guy drinks too much green tea and opens his third eye and goes insane because he can see a demon monkey. You know, there's something heavily going on.
Relatable. Very relatable.
But yeah, that's, you know, it's quite a complex, probably too much for me to kind of go into in an answer, but yeah, that would be kind of my kind of touchstone answer would be because it's other and it's different, because it's a pushback, and because it just looks really good. Like, you know, it's a really good aesthetic. It's a good aesthetic for a video game. Like, it's a visual medium. Like, it's okay to use something because it looks good.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to take one last question, which is definitely as complex and is deeply, you know, thought out. It's do you have a favorite Gothic game to recommend for the spooky season?
Favorite Gothic game? I think I would have to say Night in the Woods.
Yep.
I think it has to be Night in the Woods, because I just think it embodies the Gothic so well. It's funny. It's, you know, it's subversive. It captures that kind of American Gothic tradition really well. You know, she comes back to her deadbeat town. It does what so many contemporary Gothic texts. It reminds me Mexican Gothic, which is a novel that came out last year by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which is fantastic. There's a very similar thing where you're kind of like, this is obviously not supernatural. And then it is, but it isn't. And it's still that people, you know, the Gothic is often, there is no ghost, people are just really crap. Like, people are terrible. Be afraid of what people will do to people. Or, like in something like Crimson Peak, the supernatural exists, but it actually isn't the evil thing. Like, it's trying to protect you from an evil thing. And Night in the Woods kind of, you know, it kind of does that. And the way that it ends in terms, I don't want to spoil it for anyone that hasn't played it, but I felt like that was a game that really fantastically took on all of these different elements of the Gothic and put them together in a way that, particularly for a millennial, is very meaningful storytelling, and uses the Gothic in such a beautiful way. And parts of that game, like sometimes I'd be playing the game, I was like, yeah, we're going to the mall and we're going to like mess stuff up. And then you're like, oh, I'm having an existential crisis. Like, it really does that. But yeah, it does that balance between like terror and reality and camp and play and Gothic really, really well. So yeah, I think I would say Night in the Woods. I just really enjoyed that game, and I think it does the Gothic really, really well. But as you might have guessed, I'm a big fan of the Final Fantasy series, and I have a huge argument about why Final Fantasy 15 is actually an amazing game if you read it from a Gothic perspective. But I don't think you can at me about that on Twitter.
I feel like next in our talk series we'll go through defending the Final Fantasy games one by one.
No,
Not
I'm not
that
going to
they
force
need
me. Yeah,
yes. No, that's great.
I'm going to force my Final
And
Fantasy.
there we are. Brilliant, right. So I'm going to call it to a close just because the gremlins seem to have now attacked the servers and are taking us down one by one. I'd like to lastly just thank Dr. Nixon for being here and for obliging us with her time and just contributing to our general collective knowledge. I can't speak, obviously. It was that impactful. I'd like to thank Connor and the team at the NVM for helping us settle this up and promote it. And thank you guys for joining us and for being a part of this talk with us. So, yeah, thanks for turning up, and we will see you guys next time.